What is the Buddhist thinking about that? That there are lots of information being processed that we just are unaware of, and then it sort of pops up, and it may appear to be sort of a random negative thought, but it's actually been sort of percolating down below.
I'm not sure that the Buddhist literature actually deals with that subject, explicitly and thematically, but my guess would be what we would say, especially using the Abhidhamma concept of the rapid flow of consciousness, of different states of consciousness arising and passing away very quickly, that there can be like thoughts which are occurring in very rapid thought processes which are not consciously articulated again and again. And so the thought occurs, but it's not strong enough, determinate enough to make its way to full conscious awareness. And so it's when these very rapid and imprecise or indefinite thought processes occur repeatedly that eventually that particular line of thinking or emotion will gather enough strength to appear as a clear and determinate thought process. That's the way I would explain it.
Okay.
But it's, the idea of a subconscious or the like Freudian unconscious. These are ideas which are don't quite have exact parallels in the Buddhist analysis of mind. But we could find places, to locate them within the Buddhist scheme.
Okay.
And the idea of like an unconscious thought, an unconscious emotion, wouldn't quite square with the Buddhist psychology, because all thought, all emotion, according to Buddhism, is accompanied by consciousness. But what one would say is that if that particular state of mind or function of consciousness occurs with a certain degree of rapidity and a certain degree of weakness, it will not be prominent enough to register with the full awareness. But there's still some degree of consciousness, or even a dim degree of consciousness accompanying those thoughts and emotions. But it's through their repeated occurrence that they gather enough strength to manifest within the field of full consciousness, full awareness.
So,
I was just pointing to Johnny.
You go first.
Okay, you have it, so you go first.
So Pantheon, on the same lines, because we were actually discussing this at lunch today. So like in Madhupindika, the honey ball sutta, isn't that like a sequence of mental events?
Oh yeah.
Explained, and beyond a certain point, when a person becomes, is it manjana? Like a person beyond, so there's a progression of mental activity. It's not just it's happening subconsciously. It's perhaps our mental sensitivity to that activity might not be sharp enough with the rough mind that we think it's completely happening subconsciously.
Yeah, that's a good example. The Madhupindika speaks about the sequence. First, from the coming together of object, sense organ, and consciousness, there occurs contact. Then from contact there arises feeling. Then what one feels, that one perceives. Then what one perceives, that one thinks about. So this is at the level of thinking. Vitakka is kind of ethically neutral at that point. And it couldn't swing, I guess, the thought could swing either in a wholesome direction or an unwholesome direction. But then what happens at the next stage is that the thought process gets infiltrated, you could say, or subverted by craving, conceit, and views, and then it turns into something called papancha, which would be a distorted mental elaboration or even fabrication, which is based upon the initial data of perception, but then it superimposes ideas born of mental activity upon the data of perception. So then there takes place the mental elaboration of the initial experience, and then once that mental elaboration reaches a certain point of complexity, then it says it overwhelms the person in regard to things experienced in the past, present, and future.
So in the Buddhist practice, is it possible for a person to actually be mindful enough or be quick enough with the mindfulness such that you could stop this mental chitter-chatter before it starts to propagate?
Oh, definitely. I mean, I would say that is like the whole point, and or at least one of the main points in the practice of Buddhist meditation, particularly the observation of the mind, contemplation of the mind, because you could see that as the mind becomes increasingly subtle through the practice of meditation, or as the mind becomes more refined through the practice of meditation, then one could see thoughts occurring at increasingly subtler levels, so that one could see like the initial arising of thoughts, just in the stage, using the analogy that I used before, you could see just like the first bubbles, little bubbles starting to form as the water is getting hotter. Instead of usually we just recognize our thoughts when they reach the stage of the big bubbles bursting on the surface. But with increasing attention, with the increasing refinement of attention, then one could see the little bubbles of thoughts starting to form at the very bottom or base of the mind. And then once one sees that, then one knows, how to apply the appropriate antidote to remove those thoughts.
So Bhante, the making mind speechless like that, so it cannot comment on something.
Yeah.
And what's the connection between that and animitta?
I won't try to speak about animitta. I mean, that's supposed to be like the stage of samadhi, generally preceding the breakthrough to, the world transcending path. We could just say that attending to the mind at increasingly subtler levels helps to weed out and remove the unwholesome thoughts, and then to implant it with wholesome mental tendencies.
One last question.
Yeah.
With regard to unconscious behavior of the mind, the first moment of perception, sanya, is that happening with our control, or is it happening a bare reaction, bare occurrence, a bare phenomenon in the mind for which we has no control over? The initial perception.
Well, I'd say that in the initial perception, we are relatively passive, but the initial perception would be the bare. If we look at in terms of stages of cognition, the initial perception would be the bare reception of the data. So that person who's going to irritate me comes into the room, and at the initial stage, there's just the bare perception of a form, a figure, this at that point there's no reaction at all yet. The initial reaction would be something that it might occur initially just spontaneously, or seem to occur spontaneously. But once I recognize that tendency, then I can exercise control even over my perception. Maybe it takes some practice of contemplation to change the perception. So when this person who irritates me comes into the room, then I tend to get some feeling of animosity or hostility towards that person. Instead, I could, train myself to see that person as reflect that this person maybe was my father in my previous life, who worked, 10 hours a day to support me, to help me. Maybe he was my best friend in my previous life, or my mother. And so by training my mind in that way, then I can change my perception. So when I see that person, then I feel happy. Thinking that person is like meeting my father from a past life, or my good friend from whom I've been separated for so many years. I think Johnny still had some questions.
Actually, it was a question from the internet. Someone asked if mindfulness is required to abandon unwholesome state. Won't teaching mindfulness as non-judgmental bare attention be wrong, spreading wrong will?
I mean, this opens up a big question which is being debated by many people, whether mindfulness really means non-judgmental attention. And I think that this hinges on different meanings of the word judgmental. There's a bad meaning or negative meaning of judgmental, which means that one puts oneself always in the position of the authority, the one who is all-knowing and has the ability to judge everything, whether everything is good or bad. And when you have that judgmental tendency, then you tend to rate everything that you like as being good, and everything that you dislike or that you see as threatening to yourself or as in competition with oneself, one dismisses it as bad or undesirable. So that's the bad sense of being judgmental. And in that sense, I would say that one of the tasks of in practicing mindfulness is to give up that judgmental tendency, whereby one treats oneself as the expert or supreme authority, and then ranks everything as either agreeable to oneself or disagreeable, good or bad to the extent it's agreeable to oneself or disagreeable. But the other sense of being judgmental, I would say, or maybe this is the original sense, is having the capacity to make informed and accurate judgments about matters, particularly in practicing mindfulness, about proper, accurate judgments about one's mental states. In fact, that's what's involved in what's called Dhammavicaya, one of the second of the 7 enlightenment factors. Dhammavicaya is the investigation of mental states, and that is explained in the suttas as the ability to determine which states are wholesome, which are unwholesome, which are blameworthy, which are blameless, what are dark states, what are bright states, together with their counterparts. So in that sense, then in practicing mindfulness, one also has to be judgmental in the sense of investigating one's own mental states and being able to distinguish which are beneficial, which are harmful, which are good, which are bad. But doing so accurately and not, with the attitude that whatever I like is good, whatever I dislike is bad. Yeah, so that's my answer to that question. Yeah, but nowadays, because I think the two meanings of judgmental get conflated, so people think when you practice mindfulness that you just flow with whatever arises in the mind, and that you don't, keep your mind under observation and distinguish what kind of mental qualities are wholesome, what should be cultivated, and which kind of mental qualities are unwholesome, those which should not be cultivated.
Bhante, this is with reference to this morning's session, some questions that were asked.
Yeah.
We had to go for lunch, so it was,
Yeah.
I didn't
I
get
think
a
you have
chance.
to turn that speaker.
That's all. Yeah, so with reference to the questions that were asked, this is about some people not being Buddhist but being good human beings.
Yeah.
This applies to all religions, all people of all faiths, people who are atheists, agnostics, doesn't matter, Buddhist, non-Buddhist.
Yeah.
But to me, the most important part is that I believe in the Buddha's teachings, which is the Dhamma, and the Buddha Dhamma, and therefore, to me, I will accept everything that the Buddha is supposed to have said, which includes rebirth and attainment of enlightenment and the whole works.
Yeah.
So I don't see a problem in a non-Buddhist being good or Buddhist being not good or whatever. It's essentially that the Dhamma as taught by the Buddha is what I accept. And therefore I call myself a Buddhist.
Yeah.
So I thought, this is something that very often people confuse. The practice of Buddhism as well as, and also the teaching of the Buddha, the Dhamma. They try to say people don't practice Buddhism or whatever. It happens in every religion actually.
Yeah.
While there are people who are non-Buddhists who lead a very good life.
I mean, that is true, undoubtedly true. Yeah, there's no monopoly on good.
Yeah, exactly.
Buddhism has no monopoly on being a good person.
Right, exactly.
And as I said this morning, in the Buddha's time, those who rejected any idea of an afterlife or the workings of karma through good or bad deeds were sort of like on the outskirts, the margins of philosophical thought. And often they advocated positions which we would consider, morally deplorable today. But nowadays there are like many people who are not believers in any kind of afterlife or any kind of persistence of personal existence beyond death, who still uphold high standards of conduct. Any further comments or questions? Okay, then maybe we'll call it a day. And remember, we have the next class May 31st. And that will be, next time we'll be taking Sutta number 115. Some parts of this are a little bit controversial, as you'll see. Okay, so we'll end with 3 half bows to the Buddha. Okay, 1, 2, 3. Okay.